What is development? What is motor development? And why development is considered to be a lifespan process? And what are the main characteristics of the lifespan perspective? In this episode, we will try to answer these questions, and we will also provide some definitions of few terms that will be critical for this motor development course. So let's start reviewing the broad concept for what is development. Development is considered to be a lifespan process of change. The observed patterns and the underlying process of behavioral, emotional, and cognitive change that begins at conception and continues throughout the lifespan until death. Many professionals may be interested in development, and several could be specifically interested in motor development. Physical educators, for example, may be interested in which practices work best and whether selected tasks are developmentally appropriated or not for a particular child or group of children. Therapists would want to know the factors that affect movement abilities or how individual change that happened during an early period of life would help to rehabilitate the same individual that had, for example, a stroke during his adulthood. Bioengineers and designers may be interested in space, control panels, work environment, sport gear, and smart prosthetics. Healthcare providers might want to determine how skill development and exercise habits early in life affect health status later in your life. Development is broadly defined as a gradual progression from a relatively simple to a later and more complex form. It can happen in three different domains: motor, cognitive, and affective, or also known as a social-emotional. Remember, cognitive refers to our intellectual behavior, involves decision-making, language, numeric reasoning, information processing, etc. Affective is our social and emotional behavior. It is how and why we play our emotional physiology, friendship, parent-child interaction, emotional disorders such as depression or antisocial behavior. Motor, which is the emphasis of this course, involves body movements and motor skill performance. It refers to postural control and performance of motor actions such as walking, reaching, and it also relates to all sensory motor interactions and the biomechanics of human movements. Well, movement is inherent in our lives, and its change across time are inevitable. A good example would be to explore what are the changes that are happening during the process of learning a motor action. For example, let's think about how we change from a standalone position to learn how to walk independently. You may think that learning to walk independently is trivial, and because you have already mastered your ability to walk around, you would even take this movement for granted. A great way to show the uniqueness and great ability of humans to become skillful is to closely watch the limits faced by bioengineers in developing robots that are human-like. Let's watch this brief documentary from Honda called The Power of Dreams. There is a part of this video when researchers show they struggle in replicating what are considered to be a very common and earlier developed human motor skill, the human gait.
Nearly all the robots that have been developed so far are tools that are adjuncts to existing human faculties. There's been a coevolution between humans and their tools dating back to when our first ancestor, Homo habilis, picked up a rock 2.5 million years ago. And so robotic research is fascinating as a laboratory for exploring what remarkable creatures we human beings are.
A lot of people think of Honda as just an automobile or a motorcycle company, and they really are surprised to learn that there's this research program in robotics and that Honda has developed a robot, Osimo. The goal is to eventually have a bipedal humanoid robot that can be helpful in a person's home.
People sometimes ask, well, why would Honda go into bipedal mobility? And I think the answer is in the word mobility itself. Honda's always been a mobility company. The whole development started in 1986, and at that time, the general thinking, even among specialists, was that it would be impossible to develop a bipedal robot.
不可能にチャレンジしてみようということで、開発がスタートしたわけです。歩かせるまでに10年ぐらいかかってます。
Attempting to replicate human motion is a remarkably challenging task. It's much more complex than we would ever imagine when we look at the idea of just stepping one foot in front of the other. In many ways, the robot walks like a toddler, back and forth, very carefully, slowly, and as the robot matures, hopefully we'll see this smoothing out of the movement.
The mobility of Osimo has come so far, and all the research that went into Osimo is really bringing about some phenomenal technology, I think, that can be applied in other parts of Honda's business.
One of the reasons why we have the most fantastic anti-lock brake system in the world comes from the endeavor of building a robot that can walk upstairs.
This 20-some years of studying how to walk has provided Honda with a great insight into how to help people who are perhaps having difficulty walking with the walking assist device.
体重支持型歩行アシストはその名の通り、体重を支えることによってそのつけた人の足の筋肉と関節の負担を軽減します。人の歩行をさまざまな角度で研究しています。でその中で得られたのがそれはですね、人と機械っていうのは人と人と同じように信頼関係が必要なんです。
As you could see, walking is not a trivial motor action. It is in fact a very complex and daunting task, especially if you wish to replicate it in robots. But what are the main characteristics of the lifespan perspective? In lifespan perspective of motor development, it is a process that is lifelong, age-related but not age-determined, sequential, continuous or cumulative, individual, and multicausal. But how long does it take for motor capability to develop? That is a tricky question because your motor repertoire changes as a function of your cumulative experience as a mover in the world that you live. In the study of motor development, age is often a good variable for keeping track of developmental change, but is not a causal factor in development. In other words, we say that development is age-related but not age-determined. As age advances, development proceeds. However, development can be faster or slower at different times, and rates of development can differ among individuals of the same age. Age can be interpreted in several ways, not only chronologically. Think about how old are you? If you take into account that time elapsed since your conception, you'd have what we call post-conceptional age. If by any chance you're born prematurely, your chronological age could be corrected by stating from the due date and not from your birth date. This image depicts this age on a timeline. The gestational age is considered to be the time elapsed from conception to birth. Chronological age is the most commonly used by us to define our current age, which is the time elapsed since our birth. Post-conceptional age is a sum of gestational age and chronological age. Finally, the corrected age is the time elapsed from the due date, which sometimes, in case of preemies, does not coincide with the chronological age. We can also consider biological and developmental age. For example, biological can be morphological, skeletal, dental, and sexual ages. Developmental ages are very specific and it's measured relative to the onset of specific motor milestones. For example, the time elapsed from your first independent steps will define your walking age. The main point that I want to make here is, with so many ways to measure age, we cannot solely use chronological time to explain motor development. Development is also considered to be sequential and continuous. Sequential means that development involves sequential change. One step leads to the next step in an orderly and irreversible fashion. This change results from interactions from both within the individual and between the individual and the environment. Continuous is a process of progressively change in our functional capability. Now that we have learned conceptual factors in motor development, let's define some of the basic terms that will help us to have common understanding of motor development. The first difference that I want to explore are the nuances of motor development, learning, and control. The term motor development is used to refer to the development of movement abilities. Those who study motor development explore developmental changes in movements as well as the factors underlying those changes. Motor learning refers to movement changes that are relatively permanent, but are related to experience or practice that happen at a certain period of life, rather than during the individual lifelong process. Combining both of them, development and learning, motor control refers to the nervous system's control of the muscles to permit skilled and coordinated movements. In recent years, researchers in motor development and motor control have found so much in common. Understanding how the nervous system and movement abilities change with age expands our knowledge of motor control. In fact, we want to understand how we achieve certain levels of movement control, and this is how motor control develops. The other three terms that we have to define and differentiate are growth, maturation, aging. Growth, which is the process of an individual organism growing organically. It is a quantitative increase in size or magnitude. A purely biological unfolding of events involved in an organism changing. A good example would be height, weight, or even change in the size of tissues after a physical growth period. Maturation connotes progress towards physical maturity, the state of optimal functional integration of individuals' body systems and the human ability to reproduce. However, remember that development continues long after physical maturity is reached. As you can see, development includes and depends on growth and maturation. However, you cannot make a confusion thinking that development and maturation are synonymous. They are not. Finally, the term aging can be used in a broad sense to refer to the progress of growing older regardless of chronological age. It can also refer specifically to changes that lead to a loss of adaptability or function. Well, we hope you have enjoyed this session and that by now you know what is motor development and what are the main characteristics of a developmental perspective. Thanks for watching.